Okay, everyone, I'm going to give a little bit of a survey of alternative communities emerging in the 20th century, where we're at right now, and in terms of alternative communities emerging, some of the principles underneath them, and place Web3 and DeFi sort of in the lineage of this. Also give us some frameworks to think about these things. It doesn't seem, oh, there we go. Okay, so first I'm going to start with some concepts and some frameworks to begin thinking and place us. I'm a fellow of the Long Now Foundation. I work with several other organizations. And so I'm going to try to situate us in time and a bigger time frame. So the first idea, first concept is the Great Turning. This was initiated in the 70s by Joanna Macy, who's a really famous eco-psychologist. The idea is we're moving from an industrial growth society into a society that actually is in harmony and in integrity with the Earth systems at large. And at this Great Turning, I heard Joanna Macy maybe 20 years ago talk about that there's three great narratives, three stories that we all find ourselves within. One of those stories is status quo, everything's fine. Second story is apocalypse now, it's all going to shit, it's all going to burn. And the third story is another world's possible. And she says, these are the meta stories of our time. You find yourself in one of those, choose your lane. And I was talking with some indigenous leaders in New Mexico one time, and they said, no, that's bullshit. They said, there's another story. And I said, well, what's the other narrative? And they said, the other narrative is, we've been here, we've always been here, we will always be here. And why I introduced this is that the three narratives of meta culture, of where we're at, the culture we situate in, are stories fundamentally of disconnection, right? They're fundamentally, we're all living in a life way that's fundamentally at odds with the life system as we know it. And I think the idea, if you're here listening to communities, want to know about communities, it's coming from a deep longing to reconnect in some way, shape, or form into a different life system. This is nothing new. This is Hieronymus Bosch about 1500 when he was painting this. And you'll see sort of a Garden of Eden scene here. You'll see some really weird transhumanistic, CRISPR-esque, animalistic human world here that's sort of an ideal techno-utopia of sorts, or eco-utopia. And then you'll see sort of like where the shadow side of humanity leads, right? And we're still playing out these themes and these apocalyptic visions today. So I'm also going to introduce this idea of the ship, the raft, and the shore real quick. So the ship, the raft, and the shore. The ship, this is old religious metaphors, mainly comes from Buddhism. A lot of other mystics used it. The ship is, think of the cruise ship, mainstream society, basically the world system as we know it since World War II, at least the predominant one, neoliberal capitalism. Most people are consuming on it. Most people are asleep at the buffet line. They don't even realize it's a ship. They just take it as granted for reality. The rafts are all the counterculture movements, counterculture communities that have tried to bail off the ship and either tried to move the ship or tried to form their own, raft up and form their own communities. We'll go into those and do a little bit of survey of those. They're really important. And the shore is something that I'll introduce, which is a concept which is a very different, how would I say it, state of being or state of consciousness from the ship or the raft phase of things. I would say predominantly this conference here, almost everyone's in the rafts. And the rafts are defined by like a hyper-ephemerality, right? It's the startup, activism culture, everything's moving fast, communities don't hold together, relationships come and go, digital nomadicism. It's a lot of movement, right? And the shore is another quality. We'll get there. This is important framing for the rest of the conversation. So I'm also going to introduce one more framework real quick, which is I think the work of Web3 and DeFi and where we're at in the world right now actually fits in a much larger historic narrative. And I think we're in a different epoch as humans and as a humanity. Basically, it follows a Heidegger thesis, antithesis, synthesis framework, theology, humans have made sense of the world, myth-making, God-making. For most of human history, that shifted during the Enlightenment period into scientific materialism and reductionism. That's the framework we've been in. That's pretty well bankrupt right now, I think, from a soul perspective, but also a life systems perspective. And now we're trying to see, and people are grasping, and I would argue that most of the alternative community and raft projects that we've seen are an effort to try to define what humanity is, define what our lives are, and something more meaningful than either one of the previous systems. Maybe inclusive of both, but it really transcends them both. And we don't know where we're going right now, right? This third category is really new territory. We're entering an entirely new phase of being humans. And I think you guys have a really fundamentally important role to play, actually. And there's a lot at stake. So just to start going into the antecedents to where we are today, so some 20th century rafts, where they're emerging from. This is not exhaustive, but this is just scratching the surface, but it's some important precedents. So in the 1920s and 40s, you had these movements around art and creativity and interdisciplinary thought that were happening in Bauhaus here in Europe, that then emerged in this thing called the Black Mountain College in the United States. This is Buckminster Fuller here. This is actually the first experimental geodesic dome that was ever made. This was in 1949, actually. And this was really radical experiments in community and education and transdisciplinary being in the world. And many 20th century great artists and movements emerged out of both of those, although they're not as well known. Bauhaus obviously is a little more known than Black Mountain College. Another raft is the LGBTQ plus communities. These were mainly to survive. They were looking for refuges for their gender and sexual identities in the 1950s. They were able to survive in small communities in cities like San Francisco, New York, other places. They were real communities, right? They really bonded together out of persecution. That then led to massive change we've seen over the past, the next 70 years with those communities and our cultural ways. 60s and 70s, this was obviously a radical revolutionary time, but really was the dawn and an awakening of stripping out of those myth-making systems from before, adopting Eastern thought, adopting different alternative spiritual ways of being, and the first time the humans got the overview effect, the first time we saw planet Earth, right? First time that we began to awaken that we're a planetary species on a very fragile planet, ecological awareness and consciousness starts to emerge, and you have some real earnest movements at that moment to institute communities on the ground that are reconciled with that truth and that reality. Some of those still exist. There's a long list of them, both in Europe and the United States we can talk about, and lessons from some of those. And then interestingly, as technology really starts to shape culture and begin to shape culture, especially in San Francisco Bay Area, you have this emerging group of futurists and futurist communities. And we'll go into detail, zoom in, hopefully. There we go. So the futurists, I'm going to cite this because I think it's important principles or antecedents to Ethereum and Web3 in general. The context for them is they were deeply embedded in Silicon Valley, in the emergence of Silicon Valley and Web 1.0 and proto-Web 1.0. And their values were coming from a bunch of social cultural conditions at those times emerging out of the 60s and 70s, more or less listed here, which is they began to say this time is transformational. It's not just, it's exponential and it's transformational. It's not just linear. We've got to embrace unconventional thinking. Scenario planning is the discipline. It's participatory and liberating, and we have to enhance public ownership. That structural and individual factors should be balanced equally. This is the emergence of the discipline of complexity and systems thinking in earnest from these groups, and that we have to take an active role in world transformation. They're a very pragmatic group, and they always were looking at sustainable futures, which is more around future optionality. Stuart Brand, one of the principal founders of the futurist movement, said, "We are as gods, we might as well get good at it," referring to our technological power. And out of that, you have eco-utopia visions emerging, and you have techno-utopia versions emerging. They were quite separated. They were quite different, right? They were flying cars and no trees, and then we're all living in tree houses and have gardens and get to bicycle around, right? And thankfully, there's some like solar punk futures now and other things that hybridize all these things. I think a really important concept that I didn't write up here is called protopia. This is introduced by Kevin Kelly, another one of the seminal futurists. Protopia is this idea that utopias are all these visions that are impossible to grasp. Protopia is an idea that actually our actions now, if they're radical enough, day by day by day, actually steer us into a lived and realized version of a very different world than we realize today. Amara's law, maybe you know this, kind of associated with Moore's law, is we tend to overestimate technology's impact in the immediate term and underestimate its impact in the long term. Right? So protopia is built on this idea that the long-term impacts are massive, and I'll get to some details of that. Some 21st century rafts. Things shift as technology accelerates for our lives, basically. It's a very fuzzy image, but this is an image from the Matrix 2 when they're raving in the caves down below, right? Remember that scene? The humans are all having interesting times in the caves, and then Morpheus and the rest of them are actually outfighting the fight. And I would say kind of our current world of digital nomads is that. It's mostly fluff and parties and then there's some people actually fighting an existential battle out there. I think that's very real, and I'll frame that more specifically. But this is all fueled by the electronic revolution, by the digital revolution, including electronic music and the cultures around that. And there's a couple important values. These are values coming out of Burning Man. So these ideas, basically a libertarian participatory governance system is effectively what these 10 principles of Burning Man underlie. We could go into deeper exploration around those in Q&A if you want. I think the immediacy one maybe is really important when we get to the talk. Immediacy means this lived experience that's relational and live in the moment and tactile and connected. It's not really digital. They're also quite radically around gifting and decommodification. So they felt like kind of born from a 20th century mindset, which is, I'll get back to the, so the activist entrepreneurs, 20th century is a pretty interesting concept, actually, and we take it for granted, but in the 20th century, and really our elders, it was NGOs and governments were trying to do the good work, and for-profit companies were just out for profit. And this emergence of communities around being activist entrepreneurs, systems changers, disruptors, it's a really, really effing big deal, because it really collapses those walls down that were there in the 20th century. And I think sometimes in our capitalist system, we still get captured and sucked back into producing value and economic and financial value, but I think there's an active debate and tension going on that's mostly being lost right now around mission ethics versus capitalism and money. I decided to come to Ethereum conference because I really respected the community, whereas so much of crypto, no offense, is just full of douchebags who don't give a fuck about ethics or philosophy. And I don't find that with this community. So I really have appreciated this community for a long time. I actually didn't know, see if I can go back. Oh, yeah, this is important. So the emergence of this community of Web3 DeFi, I think, is table stakes for human survival, actually. And I'll get into what I mean. So we're entering in the past 2 decades into mainly envisioning dystopian future scenarios that feel like, and we don't even see our way out, right? It's either sort of catastrophe through bioweapons or something ridiculous. The democracy of weapons of mass destruction is not a good thing. Like, that's a great way, like, that's being decentralized. So technology is decentralizing things that are very destructive. How do we handle that on one side? And it's also creating massive centralization, right? Whether it's large mega corporations like Google and others who are owning all the data, or whether it's countries like China. And that just leads us to dystopias. And so now we're like wrestling with the question, not we are as gods with all this power, we might as well get good at it. It's like, how the hell do we survive this godlike powers that are being unleashed, that we're unleashing on ourselves, right? That's the existential question that's very real, or feels very real, whether it's real or not, that we're wrestling with. And I think that's why also Web3 and DeFi is so critical. It may be one of the only avenues to start to create other power systems, power dynamics, and what's a really dangerous game right now. This is not my area of expertise, but I felt like it was important to go into. I don't know if you know the work of Tristan Harris or Daniel Schmachtenberger, Consilience Project, or the Center for Humane Technology, but tech is not values neutral. These naive ideas that technology is neutral, that a hammer can be used to build a house or to hurt someone, is absolutely incorrect. The techno-utopian version, which says that it's net positive, the market will sort out what technologies are valuable, also BS. The Luddite view, if you guys, I don't know if you know who the Luddites are. The Luddites were weavers in Great Britain when the loom was invented. And they weren't anti-technology, they just got completely, their jobs got completely automated and wiped out. And so they developed a whole ethos around how technology is net negative. I think that's also an incorrect view, by the way. And so what we do know is that it's very complex. Technology has good, bad, and especially unforeseen consequences, especially the aspect of technology. I work in psychedelics and in neuroscience, is how much we're learning about neuroplasticity. What you pay attention to wires. That recursive feedback loop, especially with technology, is unbelievably powerful. It shapes our perceptions of reality, it shapes our intentions, it shapes the capacities that we can do. So it's not just the technology, it's the relationship our neuroplastic brains have with technology that steer us in exponential ways radically. If you have an axe or a chainsaw, you look to cut down a tree. If you have a camera, you look for beauty. If you have a spear, you're looking to what you can stab with it or throw at it, right? And usually technology, because it's a fucking, I've also been in startup land forever, it's, you guys know, it's brutal, right? You're just killing yourself to build. And the pace you have to do it at is radical, and you have to do it in sprints, and it's usually designed very narrowly, but it has massive downstream effects. So Instagram, filters, and sharing images. What I didn't share up here is a chart, since I do work in mental health, that the rate of teenage suicides among women and the direct correlation between screen time and suicidality of teenage girls is off the charts. It hasn't hit the press yet. It's unbelievably depressing. It's insane, right? So these are second and third order consequences to technology we don't think about. You guys are the creators of technology right now that has massive second and third order consequences. And I don't know how you, in being builders and creators, begin to even wrestle with these second and third order consequences that are absolutely fundamental, potentially, for the survival of humanity, legitimately. It's kind of absurd, but real and quite scary, actually. So just one more example of the plow. So when the plow was invented, agriculture was revolutionized, caloric output significantly rose. But if you create a technology that seems neutral, like the plow, more calories, more efficient farming, that granted a strategic advantage in a competitive environment, right? So those villages that adopted it versus those that didn't in the highlands, they went off and killed them. They gained more power. Those communities that didn't adopt the technology lose, right? It's a really, technology is obligate. It obligates us to consequences. It is absolutely not neutral in any way, shape, or form. And it also radically shifted societal values. It increased patriarchal structures. Women couldn't plow. Guess who controls the power now and the means of production? It increased wealth inequality and an increased hierarchy as well. Massive consequences for something as seemingly simple as a plow. So ways forward. One point I wanted to really make is this, that nihilistic tech design has to end. It must end. We kind of inherited this idea that technology is somewhat neutral and it's fine to do whatever you want with it. It's not. It's absolutely value-centered. Axiological is the term I would invite you to look up. If we absolutely have to embed values and externalities and consequences into our design. The other piece, and this goes back into some of the precedents of communities, is that full active participation to shift culture. And then finally, consciousness as the only exit door. What I mean by that is what we don't surface, our worst sides of our humanity, the shadow sides of our technology, if we don't look at the consequences, will devour us. Most philosophers of the mind will tell you that free will doesn't exist, with one exception. The recursive ability of awareness to look back at itself gives us choice. And so for each one of you, as builders in your respective ecosystems, you have to be active participants, you have to think about the consequences, and you have to rise to the occasion to bring to consciousness what the table stakes are right now. Real quick, and we'll have a little time for questions. Personally, my work is that I work with a company developing psychedelic medicines. The whole point and mission of it is to help consciousness, basically to open and expand consciousness. We have clinical stage, we're based out of Switzerland, we have a bunch of clinical stage drugs. But my real passion is Reconnect Refuges or clinics, which is actually situating, placemaking, and communities in place around consciousness, culture, connection. Basically, I see us going through a massive transition, a lot of suffering over the next several hundred years. So can we, rather than being in the raft state, I want to start working on shore projects. How can we start landing people on the shore and landing ourselves in integrated and connected ways while we go through the great turning? And then we also have Reconnect Foundation, where we pour a bunch of profits from the biotech company back out to land conservation with indigenous stewards in the Amazon basin specifically. Some of our medicines are inspired by them. And we do a lot of research at the University of Zurich around consciousness. Okay, maybe one question or two.
Thank you so much for planting these seeds and sharing so much food for thought. Yeah, we do have time for one question, so please raise your hand if you would like to ask something, and then the mic will find you. Here in the front, first row.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Maybe the rafts and the shore conceptualization, and then the psychedelic container seems to me quite rafty. So how do you make a translation from a psychedelic container to more of a...
Yeah, totally, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the raft to the shore transition or different phases and psychedelics being quite rafty. Psychedelics have many things they do. One easy way to describe them is that they dissolve boundaries, right? So sort of contracted thinking, contracted neural patterns, and they help to open those up. In that sense, they're very rafty because they're dissolving, right? Structure and foundation. However, the other thing they're doing is really situating oneself in a relational constellation, in an ecosystemic point of view in the world, in a lived way, not a conceptual way. Understanding our place in the world. Like maybe the fundamental problem is we have a partially developed prefrontal cortex. We know enough to develop fucking Ethereum, but we can't recognize that we fucking are a part of an entire Earth system and that we're related to each other, and so we're still competing and stabbing each other and bombing Ukraine. So what psychedelics do is actually raise that up an octave, and they diminish that desire for fight, and so in that way they're also grounding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I do believe you will be around, so if you have more questions for Daniel, please find him around the stage. And another big thank you and applause to him. We will be back with the next session in a few minutes, so bear with us.